The valley looked harmless the way it always did from a distance, bright as a clean sheet, wind smooth, and so quiet you could hear your own breath inside your hood. Sunlight bounced off the snow hard enough to sting the eyes. Shadows were knife-dark along the frozen creek, and the pine-lined ridges on either side stood like walls that had been there forever. It was the kind of visibility that made people careless because you could see so far you believed you could see everything. The patrol moved in a loose file where the creek cut the easiest path through the bowl. Boots squeaked in the cold. Frost clung to pack straps and weapon slings, turning every piece of fabric into something stiff and sharp. The squad lead, Lieutenant Calder, kept his glove hand up once, then down, signaling pace and spacing. The comm specialist, Rios, walked with his head tilted like he was already listening to the radio, even before he keyed it. The medic, Hale, carried his bag high so it wouldn't drag in the powder. Briggs, the support gunner, had the weight of his weapon across his chest like a promise he'd have to keep. Kellen, the designated marksman, wore his confidence the way men did when they'd never been punished for it. Chin up, eyes forward, as if the valley owed him an easy day. And slightly behind their line, almost separate, Mara Voss moved with less noise than the others. Same uniform, same kit, but her steps were measured. She watched the snow the way other people watched a room full of strangers. She listened to the wind. She blinked into the glare and adjusted the scarf at her throat so her breath wouldn't fog the glass of her optic later. Nobody talked to her unless they had to. She didn't force conversation. She didn't need to. The first explosion didn't sound like an explosion at first. It sounded like the world cracking. A pre-sighted charge buried under drift and crust punched upward, flipping snow and frozen dirt into a thick, white curtain. The air hit the patrol like a shove. For a fraction of a second, everyone's depth perception broke. The bright valley turned into a storm made of their own terrain. Something small and sharp snapped past Mara's left ear, rock splinter or shrapnel, and she felt the hot sting before the cold could catch up. Then the gunfire came. Not a ragged surprise, not the panic dumping of magazines. Clean lanes, deliberate spacing. Bursts laid down like lines drawn with a ruler from both ridges at once, crossing the creek bed and the open slope. The kill zone geometry snapped into existence, invisible but undeniable. Anyone who tried to run forward would be cut. Anyone who tried to climb out would silhouette against the snow and die. Calder shouted and pointed to the only cover that existed. Shallow ice shelve along the creek, a low berm of frozen earth, scattered boulders half buried like the backs of sleeping animals. The squad dove for what they could, sliding on their stomachs, elbows tearing at crust. The snow that had looked soft from afar was a crust over packed ice. It scraped skin through fabric. Boots kicked up powder that hung in the air, making everything hazy and bright. Rios punched his radio. Sunray. Sunray, contact, static swallowed him. The headset hissed, then a hard, rhythmic buzz that had nothing to do with weather. He tried again, switching channels fast, fingers clumsy in gloves. The same buzz chewed through every attempt. Calder grabbed his shoulder and shouted a code, word meant to trigger a backup plan. Rios shook his head, eyes wide. The radios were dead, not because they were broken, but because something out there wanted them dead. A man went down in the open before anyone could even decide to move him. It was a simple thing, one step too far from cover, one instinct to look back. The shot punched him off his feet and left him sprawled on the white slope, bleeding dark into the snow like ink spilled on paper. Hale crawled a half-body length, then froze as bullets stitched the ice lip just inches from his face. Two others were pinned behind a rock that wasn't big enough to hide their shoulders. Every time they tried to shift, the ridge fire corrected immediately, as if the enemy had rehearsed their movements. Briggs tried to answer with suppression. His weapon roared for a few seconds, then the barrel smoked, and he yanked back, forced to ration bursts. His breath came out in harsh clouds. "They've got high ground," he shouted. "They've got a heavy up there." A thump echoed from the right ridge, deeper, slower. Not a rifle. A heavier weapon, anchored behind rock, firing in patient rhythm. Each burst drove the patrol lower, made them curl into themselves. The enemy wasn't rushing. They were tightening. The valley began to fracture into small islands of survival. Calder's orders became gestures, hand slicing left, fist down, two fingers pointing. Protocol tried to live, but was being strangled by terrain and jamming and the simple fact of bullets coming from above. And then, just as the unit's fear started to spill out of its seams, a single sound cut through the violence. It wasn't loud. It was sharp, a distant crack that carried differently than the automatic bursts and the heavier thump. A rifle report with a clean, measured cadence, like someone tapping once on a table to make a room go quiet. On the left ridge, one of the enemy gunners collapsed mid-burst. The line of fire that had been chewing the creek bed stuttered, then stopped. The next second felt unreal, a pause the valley didn't know how to hold. Another crack. Farther, higher. An enemy runner, someone who had been darting between positions with a radio set, went down hard, hands still reaching for the device as if he could pull coordination out of the air by force. The enemy's rhythm faltered. Their burst came a half-beat late. Calder's head snapped up, searching. Kellen lifted his optic, scanning the ridgeline with a sudden hunger he couldn't hide. "That's not ours," he breathed, as if saying it too loud would make it untrue. No one could see who was shooting for them. The angle made no sense. The shots weren't coming from the valley floor. They weren't coming from the ridge lines that held the kill zone. They were coming from somewhere higher still, somewhere the snow glare should have made any movement obvious. Yet the bullets arrived as if delivered by the mountain itself. For one heartbeat, through drifting powder and sunstruck haze, Mara caught a shape far above, a lone figure near the snow line, almost swallowed by brightness. A human outline broken by rock and shadow. A rifle barrel that could have been a branch. Then the figure shifted, and the ridge ate her again, light and terrain closing over her like a door. The patrol huddled behind ice and rock with their radios buzzing uselessly in their ears. One man bleeding into the open snow, and a battle changing around them one single shot at a time. Nobody said it as a question, because questions were a luxury. But the thought sat in every mind like a weight. Someone was up there alone, and whoever she was either saving them or deciding what they were worth. Hours earlier, the outpost had smelled like cold metal and instant coffee. The walls were thin enough that wind made them groan. A heater clanked in the corner, fighting a losing war against the mountain air that seeped in through every seam. Calder stood over a map spread across a crate, finger-tapping a point marked with a simple square. "Sensor sight missed its last data burst," he said. "We don't know if it's weather, damage, or interference. We hike in, we verify integrity, we restore it if it's down. Daylight gives us eyes. We're in and out." It sounded like routine because it had to. Routine calmed people. Routine kept hands steady. Rios, wrapped in his cold weather layer with the radio pack on his back, frowned. "We've had interference all week," he said. "Could be atmospheric. Could be terrain shadowing the relay. Could be weather," Briggs echoed, already bored with the problem. He was the kind of man who trusted anything that let him keep believing the world was predictable. Mara didn't speak. She stood near the edge of the group, looking not at the map, but at the window where the ridgeline cut the pale sky. She checked her gloves, flexing fingers. Cold stole fine motor control first. She had learned long ago to respect that. Calder ran through rolls the way he always did. Hale for medical, Rios for comms, Briggs for support, Kellen for precision fire inside the squad's envelope. Then, almost as an afterthought, he nodded toward Mara. "Boss, Overwatch. Extra eyes. Keep us honest." Kellen grinned. "Overwatch for a sensor check," he muttered. "Fancy." Another man snickered. A joke about wasted skill, about how the mountains didn't deserve an operator like her on a day like this. The kind of humor that sounded harmless until you realized it was a way of deciding someone's value out loud. Mara adjusted the scarf at her throat and stayed quiet. Not because she didn't have words, but because words rarely changed what people had already decided. She watched the way the light hit the snow, the way it sharpened shadows. She thought about how optics fogged when breath met cold glass. She checked the battery in her small rangefinder and tucked it close to her body so the warmth would keep it alive. Cold killed batteries fast. Cold killed men too, sometimes more quietly. Outside, the valley was a bowl between two ridges. One offered high ground, but a longer, more exposed approach. The other gave speed at the cost of being predictable. The planned route followed the frozen creek, a natural line through the terrain, easy on the legs. Easy was never free. As they staged a step off, Mara walked a few paces behind the others and crouched by the packed snow near the outpost perimeter. Wind-sculpted drifts told a story if you knew how to read it. She saw scuffs near the tree line. Fresh, wrong. Not animal tracks. Too deliberate. Too spaced. She saw a faint glint in the far distance, a flicker that could have been sun on ice or a lens catching light for a second too long. She didn't call it out, not because she didn't care, but because she'd learned how dismissal felt. A warning offered to people who didn't want to hear it became a bruise that never quite healed. She filed it away instead, like a round placed carefully into a magazine, not fired yet, but ready. The sensor site's name wasn't on the map in big letters. It was marked like any other piece of equipment out here. But Mara had heard the way Calder's voice changed slightly when he spoke about it, half a notch tighter. The site tracked movement corridors. It fed higher command. If it was compromised, it wasn't just a broken box in the snow. It was a blindfold over an entire region. Before leaving, Mara checked her kit one last time. An old unit patch sat tucked inside her jacket where nobody could see it. She had stopped wearing it openly after the previous incident, after the rumors and the quiet blame that had floated around her like smoke. A name had been said in whispers back then, a name tied to a mission that went wrong. She didn't correct the whispers. She just let the silence harden into something she could carry. Calder's final instruction was simple. Stay back. Stay quiet. Don't get heroic. Mara nodded, expression unreadable. Then, as the patrol moved out into the bright, open world, she took one more look at the ridgeline. Her gaze lingered a heartbeat too long, as if she already saw how fire could converge, how retreat would bottleneck, how a long climb could turn into an impossible angle. When the ambush came, it felt like the valley had been waiting for them. The frozen creek that had seemed like a gift became a funnel. Snow banks rose on either side, channeling movement into predictable lanes. The bowl-shaped terrain offered no real cover once you were inside it. The ridges on both sides had sight lines that overlapped like cross blades. The initial blast was only the beginning. As soon as the snow curtain rose, crossfires snapped into place. One ridge, then the other, then a heavier team that thumped from behind rock. First time to keep heads down. Shots aimed not just at bodies, but at options. Rios fought his radio again and again. Each attempt drowned in that hard buzz. It wasn't random static. It was a machine's insistence. Someone had brought a jammer into the mountains on purpose. Someone had planned to isolate them, to make sure no call for help escaped the bowl. Briggs kept firing in short bursts, his breath ragged. The weapon heated fast in the cold air because there was no time to let it cool. His gloves smoked slightly where the metal radiated heat through the fabric. He swore and forced himself to stop, rationing as if each trigger pull cost something he couldn't afford to spend. Hale crawled toward the wounded man once, then twice, then stopped as bullets stitched the snow in front of him. His eyes met Mara's from across the ice lip. In them was the moral pressure that didn't care about tactics, a friend bleeding out while everyone watched. The enemy pressed like they had all the time in the world. Short bursts, controlled repositioning. A heavy gun anchored behind a spine of rock that forced the patrol to stay low. They weren't trying to win quickly. They were trying to win cleanly. Then came the bracketing fire, deep thumps that weren't quite mortars but felt close enough. Impacts punched the valley edge, throwing snow and rock into the air like warning flags. The message was simple. Don't run. Try to break out, and the bowl becomes your grave. Calder tried to shift the team to a rock outcrop that offered slightly better cover, but the route was a straight line under ridge fire. Protocol said, move as a unit. Reality said a unit moving together made a bigger target. From her overwatch position, Mara saw the geometry in full, the angles of fire, the way the enemy's bursts came in timed waves. The way one position seemed to pause for a fraction of a second every time the buzzing in her own headset spiked, like a heartbeat of jamming. Coordination lived somewhere up there behind the ridge line, protected and confident. Her optics started to betray her. Snow glare washed the glass, flattening contrast. Breath fogged the edges when she exhaled too close. A thin film crept along one corner, threatening to turn her sight picture into a blur at the worst moment. Equipment failure in the cold wasn't dramatic. It was gradual, insidious, and unforgiving. Mara made a decision without asking. It wasn't heroism. It was math. The unit could not outshoot a kill zone shaped like this. They couldn't call for help. They couldn't move. They could only endure until endurance ran out. The only way to change the equation was to remove the parts of the enemy plan that made it function: coordination, heavy weapons, explosives, leadership. To do that, she needed an angle the enemy hadn't covered, and that meant leaving her assigned spot. She slipped away up the ridge line on the blind side, moving when bursts peaked, so her steps disappeared inside the noise. Nobody saw her go. In the valley, men were too busy trying not to die to notice the absence of one quiet operator they'd already decided was extra. Calder searched for her once, eyes sweeping the slope. He didn't see her. He assumed what people assumed in chaos. Someone had been hit, someone had fallen back, someone had vanished. The story formed instantly because stories filled the gaps fear couldn't tolerate. Above them, Mara climbed. The blind side of the ridge was a different world. Wind hit harder up there, carving the snow into ripples and ridges that could hide movement if you used them right. Rock ribs jutted out at angles that broke sight lines from below. Narrow ledges cut across sheer faces where footsteps wouldn't leave a clean trail visible from the valley. She moved with her weight spread, testing crust before committing. One slip would send her sliding into open sky. She timed her motion to the enemy's firing rhythm. When the heavy gun thumped, she moved. When crossfire surged, she climbed. Violence became her metronome. Silence was what she returned to between beats. She checked the wind with loose powder pinched between fingers and let go, watching how it drifted. Cold, dense air held bullets differently than warmer lowlands. She adjusted in her mind, not with numbers spoken aloud, but with a sense earned the hard way. She kept her breathing low, directing it down into her scarf so her optic wouldn't fog. She forced herself not to look down too often, because looking down reminded the body how far it could fall. A patrol element shifted above, shapes moving through trees, careful and patient. Not panic militia. Climbers. Flankers. The enemy had depth. They weren't just shooting from ridgelines. They had people moving to close nets, people who understood that once you pin a unit, you hunt what slips away. Mara froze inches from the skyline, pressed against rock that stole heat through her layers. She let the wind pass over her. She let her pulse slow. A wrong movement would silhouette her in bright snow, and a silhouette was an invitation. When the patrol element moved on, she chose a route that would have made a doctrine instructor wince. Too steep, too exposed. The kind of climb you didn't do unless you had no better option. But it offered one thing the safe routes didn't: a line of sight behind the enemy's main ridge team, a place where the kill zone's architects never expected a rifle to speak. She found the jammer's signature without electronics. She found it by watching behavior. A runner leaned repeatedly toward a sheltered nook behind a rock shelf. Antenna silhouette flickered there against the sky. Men moved near it with a certain care, as if the device mattered more than the shooters around it. Coordination had a physical home. Ammo became a real constraint as she settled into position. She counted magazines and felt the weight of each round. Up here, resupply was a fantasy. Each shot had to buy time. Each shot had to remove a force multiplier. Waste was death in slow motion. She built a micro-hide the way you build a lie. Carefully, convincingly. She packed snow against rock to smooth, unnatural edges. She used a shadow line to break her outline. She kept her body low, letting the mountain swallow as much of her as it could. Daytime concealment in bright snow wasn't luck. It was patience and practice and an understanding of how human eyes hunted contrast. Below, the valley fight echoed like thunder trapped in a bowl. Every shout, every burst, every moment of panic reached her as a dull roar. She heard someone scream, pain or fear, impossible to tell at this distance, and the sound tried to hook into her ribs. She forced it away, not because she didn't care, but because caring had to become function if anyone was going to live. Do the work. She set her target ladder in her mind. Coordination first. Explosives next. Heavy weapons. Leadership. Then, if they came for her, she would deal with hunters. Not in the order her emotions wanted, but in the order the battle demanded. She settled her rifle into the snow, found her sight picture through glare and shadow, and waited for the moment that mattered. The jammer operator shifted, exposed a fraction of himself as he adjusted something behind the rock shelf. Mara's trigger press was slow, controlled, almost gentle. The rifle cracked once. The man folded like his strings had been cut. Down in the valley, Rios's headset buzz changed. It didn't clear. It didn't return comms like magic. But the rhythm shifted like a choke loosening. Calder noticed it instantly, eyes snapping to Rios, then back to the ridges, understanding that something in the enemy plan had just been struck. Mara didn't let herself feel satisfaction. Satisfaction was a distraction. She watched for the next force multiplier. A runner lunged for the fallen radio set, trying to take over. Mara tracked him, waited until he committed, then fired. He dropped mid-sprint, hand reaching, coordination dying again. On the ridge, an RPG team shifted position, tube angled toward the valley's shallow cover. Mara saw the carrier first. Weight and intent give people away. She hit him. The assistant hesitated, then reached for the launcher with frantic hands. Mara hit him too. Explosives were a problem until they weren't. The crew-served gunner anchoring suppression kept firing in short, disciplined bursts. He was the spine of the kill zone's violence. Mara waited for the moment he leaned forward to correct his aim, then took him out. The rhythm of pinned-down fire broke, and for the first time in long minutes, the valley breathed. Calder didn't waste a breath. He signaled hard, 2 fingers, then a pull motion. Hale and another man crawled fast, not standing, not running, just dragging themselves through crust and powder to the wounded teammate. Bullets still snapped overhead, but the enemy's timing was wrong now. The gaps were real. They yanked the wounded man by his vest and hauled him behind the ice lip, Hale's hands instantly working to stop the bleeding with whatever he could cram into the wound. Mara watched the move and felt a tightness in her chest loosen by a fraction. Not relief, just confirmation that her shots were changing the battle exactly the way they needed to. Then the enemy adapted. They didn't panic. It didn't scatter. They did something worse. They got smart. Fire shifted upward, probing the ridge line with deliberate pattern shots. The enemy understood angles, understood that the shots disrupting them had to be coming from above and behind. A small team broke off from the main ridge group. Hunters, climbers using trees and rock, moving with patience rather than urgency. They weren't trying to win a firefight. They were trying to close distance on a ghost. A small drone appeared briefly over the ridge, buzzing like an insect that didn't belong in winter. It floated just long enough to make Mara's skin tighten. A drone didn't need to see her clearly. It only needed to notice movement that shouldn't be there, warmth that didn't match the landscape. Mara didn't move. Not an inch. She let the drone pass, let it drift away, as if the mountain was empty. Her muscles burned from holding still. Snow melted slightly under her body heat, and then refroze, trying to glue her to the rock. She ignored it. Her barrel warmed with each shot she'd taken. Heat shimmer was faint in cold air, but not non-existent. She couldn't afford rapid fire. She shifted her position inches at a time, changing the angle so any return fire would hit where she had been, not where she was. Below, the enemy attempted a flank on the valley too, trying to finish the unit while the hunters pursued her. Two-front pressure. A smart enemy's way of refusing to let disruption become defeat. Mara searched for the real note of command, the one directing both the kill zone and the counterhunt. It wasn't always the loudest man. It was the one others looked toward before moving, the one whose gestures were obeyed. She found him near a second piece of equipment behind the jammer's former position, a backup kit protected, ready. He crouched with a map board, barking silent orders that turned into movement along the ridge. His head lifted once, scanning the valley like he was admiring his own trap. Mara's sight picture steadied. She accounted for wind, for glare, for the way cold air carried sound. She let her breath out slowly and pressed the trigger. The turning point shot wasn't dramatic in sound. It was dramatic in consequence. The field leader dropped, and something invisible snapped. Enemy fire became emotional instead of timed. Bursts came too long, too wild. Men shifted without coordination, some retreating to regroup, others trying to assert control with volume. The kill zone's architecture, so clean, so deliberate, began to crumble. Calder saw the change and drove his unit through it. He signaled smoke. One canister rolled and hissed, throwing a gray smear across white snow. In that thin cover, the squad pushed as a single organism, dragging their wounded, moving toward the valley edge where the bracketing fire had been. The enemy had spent so much effort shaping the bowl that they hadn't built the same certainty outside it. Mara kept firing only when it mattered. A man lifting a tube, a shooter trying to re-anchor suppression, a runner attempting to rally others. Each shot was a lever, moving the fight's weight away from the patrol and toward confusion. The hunters kept coming, crunching snow above and behind her, faint, rhythmic, careful. Not the frantic stampede of men chasing noise, but the quiet advance of people who knew how to close on a firing position. Mara felt the urge to turn, to take a risky shot at the sound. Ego wanted a clean kill. Ego wanted to prove dominance. Function wanted survival. She chose restraint. She let the hunters get close enough that she could hear the soft scrape of gear against rock. Then she slid backward from her micro-hide, low and slow, letting snow fill the depression she'd made. She moved into the ridge's blind folds, disappearing into the terrain the same way she had arrived. Not by speed, but by understanding. Down in the valley, the squad reached a better extraction lane as the enemy's cohesion continued to break. The radios still weren't fully back, but the buzzing had softened enough that Rios caught fragments. Half-words, distant replies, the first proof that isolation was ending. Calder didn't waste time celebrating. He pushed harder because extraction windows in the mountains weren't forgiving and daylight didn't last forever, even when the sun was bright. When a unit finally broke out of the bowl, they were shaking from more than cold. Hale had his hands inside a torn-open jacket, trying to keep pressure on the wounded man's wound while walking. Briggs's eyes were bloodshot from snow glare and adrenaline. Kellen looked back repeatedly, as if he couldn't accept leaving a fight unfinished. The extraction point was a patch of ground scraped clear of snow, wind whipping hard enough to sting exposed skin. A bird's distant rotor sound crept in, rescue coming late, but coming. The squad clustered, weapons out, scanning ridges and tree lines. Nobody spoke much. Speech felt too fragile after the valley. Mara arrived later. No grand entrance. No heroic silhouette. Just a lone figure cresting a slope, snow-caked, moving like someone who had spent hours turning her body into part of the mountain. Her hands were bruised under gloves from rock. Her breath came controlled but deep. She stopped at the edge of the group, and the unit's noise died without anyone ordering it to. Calder stared at her for a long moment, the way a man stares at something he didn't know he needed until it was the only thing keeping him alive. Kellen's mouth opened as if to speak, then closed. Whatever he'd been ready to say, joke, accusation, disbelief, didn't fit anymore. Rio swallowed, eyes flicking to her rifle, then back to her face. Hale's gaze was tired and grateful and heavy with the kind of relief that came after you'd watched someone almost die and then not die. They didn't debrief in the snow. Not fully. They waited until the outpost, until walls and heat and the smell of coffee made reality feel solid again. Inside, Calder spread the map on the crate and traced lines with a gloved finger, replaying the geometry like he needed to see the trap as an object he could hold. They shaped it around the sensor approach, he said, voice flat. They knew we'd come through the creek. They put high ground teams on both ridges. They used bracketing fire to lock the bowl, and they jammed comms to keep us isolated. Rios nodded grimly. That wasn't atmospheric. That was a dedicated jammer. Backpack unit, probably with a backup kit. His eyes flicked to Mara, not accusing, recognizing. Calder continued, and in the clinical tone of analysis, the enemy motive came into focus. The ambush hadn't been just to kill a patrol. Killing was a bonus. The real objective was the sensor site, the data logs, the movement corridors it tracked, the proof they could blind the area and bait a response. Destroy the box or steal its guts, then use the event as propaganda and operational advantage. A message that the mountains belonged to them, that the outpost couldn't protect its own eyes. That's why they were so prepared, Hale murmured. It wasn't about us personally. It was about what we represent, Calder agreed. Mara stood slightly apart, leaning against the wall where the heater's warmth couldn't reach her fully. Her scarf was off now, and the skin around her mouth was chapped, raw from cold air. She listened without interrupting, letting others build the narrative around facts. When Calder described the kill zone setup, Mara spoke once. There were scuffs near the tree-line, she said quietly. Fresh, not animals. And a glint, could have been ice, could have been glass. I saw it on step off. The room went still. Kellen's face flushed slightly. He remembered the joke about wasted skill. He remembered dismissing routine like it was armor. Rios stared at the map, then at the floor. Briggs shifted uncomfortably as if the cold had found its way into the room again. Calder didn't argue. He didn't excuse. He nodded once, slow. You saw the warning signs. Mara's eyes stayed level. I noted them. Hale exhaled a tired sound. Noted them saved us. Cost was accounted for the way it always was after violence. Ammo nearly spent, fingers numb, bruises where a rock had bitten through layers, a teammate still in the medic bay with a prognosis that depended on hours and luck. The unit's faces held the aftermath, shock settling into memory, adrenaline draining into fatigue. Then Calder's gaze sharpened slightly, not on tactics now, but on something older. They blamed you before, he said, not loudly, not in a way that would spread beyond the room. That other mission, Mara didn't flinch, but her jaw tightened a fraction. The old unit patch inside her jacket might as well have weighed 100 pounds. Rumors had said she was too slow. Rumors had said she hesitated. Rumors had said she took a shot she shouldn't have taken, or didn't take one she should have. The truth had been more complicated, as truth always was. But complication didn't travel well. Blamed it. I learned, she said simply, as if that was the only part of the past worth carrying forward. I learned that noise doesn't prove anything. Calder looked down at the map again, then back up. What you did today. Mara cut him off with a small shake of her head. Not rude, just firm. I did the work. The words sat in the room like a final piece of the puzzle. Fear had been there. Everyone in the room knew that. But function had been stronger. Quiet competence had changed a battle that should have ended them. Respect came in a different language than praise. It came in the way Briggs stopped treating her as extra space. It came in the way Rios asked afterward how she had found the jammer position without electronics, genuinely wanting to learn. It came in the way Kellen didn't speak at all for a while, then finally said, I didn't see what you saw, like confession and acknowledgement rolled into one. Later, when the outpost settled into its night rhythm and the wind pressed against the walls again, Mara sat alone at a bench and cleaned her rifle with slow, practiced motions. Oil shone dark against metal. Cloth dragged across the barrel. Outside, daylight had faded into a pale, cold dusk, but the snow still held enough light to glow softly through the window. The valley had been chaos. The ridge had been silence. The difference between them had been measured in single shots and the decision to keep moving when everyone else was forced to stay pinned. Mara finished cleaning, reassembled the rifle, and set it down with care. Her hands ached. Her shoulders carried the weight of hours spent turning herself into a ghost. Somewhere in the medic bay, a man breathed because a window had opened at the right time. Somewhere on the ridge, An enemy plan lay broken because its force multipliers had been removed in the only order that mattered. Calder passed by the doorway and paused, watching her for a second. No speech, no ceremony, just a nod that meant more than a dozen loud compliments. Mara returned the nod without looking for approval, then went back to her work. Outside, the mountain held its quiet again, as if it had never been shattered. Snow reflected the last light, like it was trying to erase the day's violence from memory. But inside the outpost, in a way the unit moved around her now, careful, respectful, no longer dismissing her presence, the battle remained. Not as noise, but as meaning. Quiet, they finally understood, wasn't absence. Quiet was control. Quiet was survival. And in the bright snow of daytime, where the world looked too clean to hide anything, one lone operator had proven that the mountain always had room for a ghost.